else was really stupid, which I don't believe at all, or they meant something else by this. And I don't know if she was thinking, Hannah in her song was thinking that Samuel counted for two because this firstborn always got a double portion of the blessing, and maybe that. Or maybe she was just saying that people who trust in the Lord will be given everything that they desire. And 7 being a number of completeness. And she wasn't really talking about having 7 literal children, but saying that God would provide all of her needs. But God did provide all of her needs. And then Hannah gives us a list of God's actions. And some of them are amazingly positive. He makes people alive. He raises from the dust. He lifts them up from the ash heap. He exalts. He causes people to inherit a throne. He seats people with princes. He's going to guard us. He's going to give us strength in verse 10. He sends wealth in verse 7. He raises up from the grave in verse 6. I don't know where the Sadducees got the idea that God didn't raise people from the dead, but Hannah believed that God could bring us back from the dead. God does all of these things for us. It's a tremendous list of what God can and does do for those who trust Him and love Him. But some of these things, if we displease God, if we've turned our back on God, then there's also the negative side of what God does in this world. Sometimes He sends poverty. Sometimes He humbles. Sometimes He thunders. I think that's what was going on earlier in the service. Sometimes He says He will judge. And sometimes He brings death. And sometimes He brings us down to the grave. God is in charge of life and death. And He evaluates our lives. And He judges our lives. He has this right as the Creator. He doesn't judge indiscriminately, but He does judge fairly. But He still judges. And the consequences of our sin is death. We need to understand that in this world. Now, God doesn't perform these actions indiscriminately. Hannah says that He judges those who oppose and He rewards His saints. He doesn't just act, randomly in people's lives. He rewards those people who follow after Him, who are obedient to Him, who have a relationship with Him. And He judges those people who oppose Him, who are against what He is trying to accomplish in this world. Now, Hannah uses, toward the end of this poem, 2 very interesting words. She says that God will make a king and an anointed one. These are very interesting because, one, Israel didn't have a king at this time. She might have been looking at the surrounding countries and saying, there's a king and he will be anointed. They inaugurated people as king by anointing them. They didn't have a swearing-in ceremony. They poured oil on a person's head, and that's how they became king, how they anointed them king. Well, this word anointed is the Hebrew word Messiah, the Greek word Christ. Is Hannah saying that the Christ will come, that the Messiah will come? This is what Mary thought, because she quotes this song. She repeats this song almost verbatim. She just has read this song, and she knows this song, and she talks about the same themes that Hannah does. She talks about the lowly being exalted, and the exalted being brought down, and she talks about being blessed, and she talks about God giving her a son who is going to be the Messiah, who will take away the sins of the world. Mary had read this song. Verse 11 starts the comparison between Eli and Samuel, between Hannah's family and Eli's family. And it says that Samuel ministered before the Lord. His upbringing is now transferred from Elkanah, who was his dad, to Eli, who was the high priest, to take care of his training to be a priest. And the comparison goes on. And then it talks about all the blessings that are bestowed upon Hannah's family. And then it talks also about judging Eli's family. 2 families that the book of Samuel puts next to each other so that we can know what God is doing in this world. The destinies of these 2 families are intertwined. And one of the things that we need to learn is that being related to a high priest is no substitute for having a relationship with God. Just because you are related to a Baptist doesn't mean that you're going to go to heaven. Just because you're related to a Christian doesn't mean you're going to go to heaven. Because your grandparents were Christian, you're going to go to heaven. Now, years ago in this church, in the old record book, it says that some of the people became members by relation. And when I first read that, I thought, what? How do you get to be a member by relation? You know somebody in the church? You had relatives in the church and they let you in? Well, what they meant was you related your salvation experience. You related your baptism experience. They didn't have paperwork, so they had to get in by relation. We have to have the same way. We have to have an experience with God. We have to have a relationship with God. Being related to somebody in the church, being related to somebody that you know who's a Baptist is not going to get you into heaven. We have to have a relationship with God. And whether we have a fancy pedigree or whether we have social position or whether we have money or power or whatever this world values, this is not going to help us either. It is no alternative to purity. It will not help you get in. We need to know that, and Eli needed to know that. Well, Eli's family treated the Lord's offering and their position in the tabernacle and the worship services of God at that time with absolute contempt. It says that they were wicked. Now, some of your versions say that they were the sons of Belial, Belial was one of the gods of their age, and Belial was a horrible person, and by saying that, the author of Samuel says that they were wicked people. They had no regard for it. They literally did not know the Lord. They didn't know who they were dealing with or what was going on, and these people, Hophni and Phinehas, were just horrible, horrible men. At the start of their story, though, Hophni, Phinehas, or Samuel knew the Lord. If you read chapter 3, verse 7, next week's sermon, if you read verse 7, it says Samuel didn't know the Lord yet. We all start off the same way. None of us know the Lord at the beginning. None of us have a relationship with God. We have to choose to follow God. We have to start to be obedient to Him, and we have to build that relationship with Him. But while Hophni and Phinehas were despising the Lord, Samuel was serving Him, which we read about in verse 11. Samuel was doing the things necessary to bring him into fellowship with God, to build that relationship that he could have with the Lord in later years. Now, one of the things that these two sons of Eli were doing was they were offering strange sacrifices. If you read about the fork and the things that were going on, these sacrifices were not mentioned anywhere in the books of Moses. Now, Moses had said, you need to worship the Lord this way, and if you don't, you are in big trouble. In fact, people had died because they had offered what is called strange fire. Well, Hophni and Phinehas were getting away with it. They were doing things that God had not prescribed. But God was patient with them, but His patience did run out. Hophni and Phinehas were also taking their share of the fellowship offerings before the fat was burned. Now, what this means was that they were part of the offering that they dedicated to God and symbolically gave to God by burning it totally, and nobody got to eat any of it. Now, the priests did get a share, and the people who offered the sacrifices got a share, so that everybody was benefited by this, but God was supposed to get His first. Well, they were giving a bad name to religion in Israel because they got their cut first. They got the good stuff before any of it was offered to the Lord. And God says, that isn't the way it should be. You need to give me the first fruits. Well, Samuel is just the opposite. He ministers before the Lord, and the Lord blesses his family. Now, Elkanah's family was given more children, and Eli's family, his children would